November 10, 1944. The first snow of the season dusted the peaks of the Absaroka Mountains, casting long shadows across the Morrison Ranch in southern Montana. While American soldiers pushed through the forests of France and Belgium, a different kind of war was arriving on Jack Morrison's doorstep. 3 military trucks rumbled up the dirt road, carrying cargo that would change everything the ranchers thought they knew about their enemy. Inside those canvas-covered beds sat 23 German women, prisoners of war who had been captured during the Allied advance through Europe. They were being sent to remote locations across America, far from the coasts and major cities where their presence might cause unrest. The Morrison Ranch, with its isolation and available labor needs, had been designated as a temporary holding facility. Jack Morrison stood on his porch, arms crossed, watching the convoy approach. At 45 years old, his face was weathered by decades of Montana sun and wind, but nothing had aged him like the telegram that arrived 6 months earlier. His son, David, had died on Omaha Beach during the D-Day invasion. Now the army was asking him to house and guard German prisoners. The irony felt like a knife twisting in his chest. The trucks came to a halt near the barn, diesel engines coughing into silence. Captain Richard Walsh, a young officer who looked barely old enough to shave, stepped down from the lead vehicle. He carried paperwork and wore an expression that suggested he was as uncomfortable with this assignment as Jack felt receiving it. "Captain Morrison," Walsh said, extending his hand. Jack noticed the man avoided eye contact. "Thank you for accommodating this arrangement. I understand it's not ideal, but we have limited facilities for female prisoners." "Not ideal," Jack repeated, his voice flat. He did not take the offered hand. "Captain, my boy died fighting these people. Now you want me to give them beds and meals." Walsh's hand dropped. His jaw tightened. "I understand your loss, sir, but these are prisoners of war under our protection. The Geneva Convention requires humane treatment regardless of personal feelings." The canvas flaps of the trucks were pulled back and the women began to descend. They wore a mixture of gray auxiliary uniforms and civilian clothes, all of it worn and travel-stained. Their faces showed exhaustion, fear, and something else that Jack could not quite name. Perhaps it was shame, or maybe just the hollow look of people who had lost everything and expected nothing but more loss ahead. Liesl Mueller was the first to step onto Montana soil. At 26, she had been a communications officer stationed in Belgium when American forces overran her position. She stood straight despite her fatigue, her dark hair pulled back severely, her blue eyes scanning the ranch with the careful assessment of someone trained to evaluate tactical situations. What she saw was a working cattle ranch, transformed into a makeshift prison. Barbed wire had been strung around one of the bunkhouses. Armed guards stood at intervals, most of them local ranch hands who had been deputized for this purpose. The mountains rose in the distance, beautiful and utterly foreign. This was not the America she had been taught to hate. It was something else entirely, something she had no context for understanding. The bunkhouse that would serve as the women's quarters had been hastily prepared in the week before their arrival. Sarah Morrison had overseen the work herself, her conscience wrestling with her grief. 23 narrow cots lined the walls, each with a thin mattress, a wool blanket, and a pillow that had seen better days. A pot-bellied stove sat in the center of the room, its pipe extending through the roof. 2 small windows on opposite walls allowed limited light and air. It was clean but austere, functional but unwelcoming. As the women filed inside, carrying the few possessions they had been allowed to keep, Sarah watched from the doorway. She had lost her son, her only child, to these people's war. Yet standing here, seeing these exhausted women who looked barely older than girls, she found her hatred more complicated than she had expected. They did not look like monsters. They looked like daughters, sisters, mothers. They looked human, and that made everything harder. Liesl chose a cot near the stove and set down her small canvas bag. Inside were 3 items: a photograph of her parents standing in front of their Berlin apartment building, a worn copy of Goethe's poetry, and a wooden comb her mother had given her before she left for military service. Everything else she had owned was lost somewhere between Belgium and Montana. She sat on the edge of the cot, feeling the thin mattress compress under her weight. Around her, The other women were claiming their spaces in silence, each lost in private thoughts about how their lives had brought them to this moment. Anna Schneider, the young nurse, sat 2 cots away, her hands trembling as she tried to fold a spare shirt. Frida Klein, barely 19, had already begun crying softly into her pillow, homesick for Stuttgart and her family's bakery. Elise Weber, the widow, stared at the ceiling with dry eyes that had long ago run out of tears. Buck Henderson appeared in the doorway, his large frame blocking most of the light. He wore a Colt revolver on his hip and an expression that made clear his feelings about his new charges. "Listen up," he said in English, not caring whether they understood. "You work, you eat. You cause trouble, you don't. Simple as that. We're not here to be your friends, you're prisoners, and don't forget it." Liesel understood enough English to grasp his meaning. She stood slowly, drawing the attention of both the American guard and her fellow prisoners. In careful, accented English, she addressed him directly. "We understand," she said. "We will follow the rules. We do not want trouble." Buck's eyes narrowed. He had not expected any of them to speak English. "So you understand me," he said. "That's convenient. Makes my job easier. You can translate for the others. Tell them they're expected at the main house at 6 in the morning. There's work to be done." After he left, the women gathered around Liesel, speaking in rapid German. "What did he say?" Anna asked. "Are they going to hurt us?" Liesel translated Buck's instructions, softening his harsh tone slightly. "We are to work," she explained. "It is what prisoners do. We should be grateful they are not worse." But Elise, the widow, shook her head. "Grateful," she said bitterly. "We are captives in a foreign land, sleeping in a shed like animals. What is there to be grateful for?" Liesel met her eyes. "We are alive," she said simply. "That is more than many can say." Through the small window, the Montana sky was beginning to darken, stars appearing one by one in the vast expanse above. It was a sky unlike any Liesel had seen in Europe, endless and overwhelming in its openness. She wondered if that sky looked the same over the ruins of Berlin, over the graves of all the boys and men who would never see another sunset. She wondered if her parents were still alive, if the apartment in the photograph still stood, if anything of her old life remained beyond memories and regrets. Dawn came early to the Morrison Ranch, painting the mountains in shades of rose and gold. The women were roused at 5:30 by the clanging of a bell that echoed across the compound. They dressed quickly in the cold morning air, their breath visible in the unheated bunkhouse. Sarah Morrison had left work clothes outside their door during the night, sturdy denim pants and cotton shirts that were practical for ranch work. The garments were mismatched and oversized, donated by local families who had mixed feelings about their use, but they were warm and functional. By 6 o'clock, all 23 women stood in an uneven line outside the enfellment, main house, waiting for instructions they might not understand. Jack Morrison emerged onto the porch, his coffee cup steaming in the frigid air. He studied the women with an expression that revealed nothing of his thoughts. Behind him, Danny Brennan and Samuel Chen waited, both men wearing heavy work gloves and looking uncertain about the day ahead. Jack took a long drink of his coffee before speaking. "You'll be divided into groups," he said, his voice carrying across the yard. "Some will work the kitchen with Sarah. Others will help with livestock, mending fences, general maintenance. We're short-handed because most of our regular workers enlisted. You're here to fill that gap." He paused, then added with deliberate emphasis, "You work hard, you'll be treated fair. You don't, and you'll find out what discipline means." Liesel translated his words into German, and the women nodded their understanding. The first group, including Anna and Frida, followed Sarah into the ranch house kitchen. The second group went with Buck to the barns. Liesel found herself assigned to fence repair with Danny Brennan and Samuel Chen, along with 3 other German women. They loaded tools into an old Ford pickup and drove into the pastures where winter winds had damaged barbed wire fencing. The work was cold, dirty, and physically demanding. Danny demonstrated how to stretch new wire tight and secure it to the posts. He spoke slowly, using gestures to bridge the language gap. Liesel watched carefully, then repeated his actions. Her hands, more accustomed to operating radio equipment than manual labor, struggled with the unfamiliar tools. Samuel Chen worked alongside them, saying little but observing everything. He had grown up facing prejudice in Montana, where his family's Chinese heritage made them perpetual outsiders despite 3 generations on American soil. He recognized something familiar in the way the German women carried themselves, that careful dignity of people who knew they were unwelcome but refused to show weakness. During the midday break, Samuel shared his canteen with Liesel when he noticed hers was empty. She looked at him with surprise, then accepted the water with a quiet thank you. Danny, watching the exchange, pulled out sandwiches Sarah had packed and offered them around. The German women hesitated, unsure if this was permitted. Liesel accepted first, and the others followed her lead. When they returned that evening, exhausted and sore, Liesel wrote in her diary by candlelight, "Today we worked as laborers, not soldiers. Today we were treated as humans, not enemies. I do not know what this means yet, but I feel something changing." 3 weeks passed in a rhythm of work and wary coexistence. The German women rose before dawn, labored through the daylight hours, and returned to their bunkhouse exhausted each evening. The Americans maintained professional distance, offering instructions but little conversation. The 2 groups moved around each other like dancers following choreography, close but never touching, aware but never connecting. Then winter arrived in earnest, bringing with it temperatures that plunged below zero and winds that howled across the prairie like wounded animals. The bunkhouse stove, adequate for autumn, proved insufficient against December's assault. The women huddled under their thin blankets, wearing every piece of clothing they owned, still shivering through the nights. Danny Brennan noticed it first. He was making his rounds one evening when he passed near enough to the bunkhouse to hear the women inside, not complaining but simply trying to keep warm by moving around, stamping their feet, rubbing their hands together. He thought of his own sisters back in Boston, imagined them in similar conditions, and something in his chest tightened. Without asking permission, he went to the storage shed and retrieved 4 additional wool blankets that had been set aside for spring cattle drives. He left them outside the bunkhouse door, knocked twice, and walked away before anyone could see who had brought them. The next morning, Liesel found the blankets. She knew immediately they had not been authorized, that someone had taken a risk to provide this small comfort. That evening, she waited until Danny was working alone in the equipment barn, cleaning tools. She approached carefully, aware that unsupervised contact between prisoners and guards was forbidden. In her hands, she carried something small, wrapped in cloth. "Mr. Brennan," she said quietly. He looked up, surprised and slightly alarmed by her presence. She held out the wrapped item. "The other women and I, we wanted to thank you for the blankets." Danny hesitated, then accepted the bundle. Inside was a small, carved wooden figure, a horse, roughly made but clearly crafted with care and attention. One of the women, Katrin, had whittled it from a piece of scrap wood using a borrowed knife, working on it during their brief evening free time. Danny turned the carving over in his hands, moved in a way he had not expected. "You did not have to do this," he said. Liesel met his eyes. "You did not have to bring blankets," she replied. "Yet you did." Her English had improved remarkably over the weeks, shaped by necessity and natural aptitude. Danny nodded slowly, understanding passing between them that transcended the language barrier and the designation of captor and prisoner. This small exchange, blankets for gratitude, kindness for acknowledgement, marked a turning point that neither could have articulated but both felt deeply. That night, Samuel Chen noticed the carved horse on the shelf in Danny's corner of the bunkhouse. When he asked about it, Danny simply said, "A gift." Samuel understood without further explanation. The wall between enemies and humans was beginning to develop cracks, small fissures through which unexpected light was starting to shine. January 1945 brought more than snow to the Morrison ranch. It brought news from Europe that would shatter whatever remained of the German women's understanding of their own country. The International Red Cross had finally processed enough paperwork to allow limited mail delivery to prisoner of war camps across America. For weeks, the women had waited desperately for word from home, clinging to hope that their families had survived the Allied bombing campaigns and the chaos of Germany's collapsing war effort. When the letters finally arrived, they brought devastation of a different kind entirely. Liesel received 3 letters simultaneously, all dated months apart, all delayed by the machinery of war and bureaucracy. The first was from her mother, written in October, describing how their Berlin neighborhood had been reduced to rubble by RAF bombing raids. Her father had been killed while trying to put out fires after an attack. Her mother was living in the basement of what remained of their building, surviving on rations that grew smaller each week. The second letter, from November, was shorter and more desperate. Her mother had heard rumors of terrible things happening in camps to the east, places with names like Auschwitz and Treblinka. She wrote, "They say these stories cannot be true, that they are Allied propaganda. But Liesel, I fear they are not lies. What have we been part of?" The third letter was not from her mother at all. It was from a neighbor, informing Liesel that her mother had died in December during another bombing raid. She was alone in the world now, an orphan at 26, the last of her family line. Around the bunkhouse, similar scenes unfolded. Anna Schneider read that her entire family had been killed when Munich was firebombed. Frieda Klein learned her father's bakery no longer existed, and her 2 brothers had died on the Eastern Front. Elise Weber, already a widow, discovered her parents had perished in the siege of Hamburg. But more disturbing than personal losses were the references, in nearly every letter, to rumors of concentration camps, of systematic murder, of atrocities that defied comprehension. The American Guards had also been receiving newspapers and military reports about the liberation of these camps. Captain Walsh arrived at the ranch with a stack of publications, including photographs that had been deemed suitable for prisoner viewing. He gathered the women in the dining hall and, through Liesel's translation, explained what Allied forces were discovering as they pushed deeper into Germany. The images were grainy but unmistakable. Emaciated bodies stacked like cordwood, survivors who looked more like skeletons than humans, gas chambers disguised as showers, ovens built for burning human remains. The scope and systematic nature of the horror was beyond anything the women had imagined possible. Anna Schneider began to weep uncontrollably. Frieda ran from the room and vomited outside. Elise sat motionless, her face drained of all color. Liesel felt the greed, room spinning around her, her carefully constructed understanding of her service, her country, her identity, crumbling like the ruins of Berlin. That night, she wrote in her diary with shaking hands, "We thought we were defending our homeland. We discover we were defending hell itself. What does it mean to be German now? How do we carry this shame?" February brought a thaw, not just in the weather but in the atmosphere of the ranch. The revelations about Germany's crimes had changed something fundamental in how the Americans viewed their prisoners. These were not hardened Nazis or committed ideologues. They were young women who had been lied to, manipulated, and used by a regime whose true nature they were only now beginning to comprehend. The grief and horror displayed by the prisoners had been too genuine to dismiss as performance. Even Buck Henderson, the most hostile of the guards, had softened slightly after watching Anna Schneider collapse in the dining hall, sobbing for hours about what her country had done. Jack Morrison sat in his kitchen one evening in late February, drinking coffee and wrestling with his conscience. Sarah worked at the stove, preparing dinner, but her mind was clearly elsewhere. They had barely spoken about the German women since the letters arrived, both of them processing privately what it meant to house people who were simultaneously victims and participants in unimaginable evil. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "Jack," she said quietly, "I've been thinking about Thanksgiving." He looked at her with confusion. "Sarah, Thanksgiving was months ago. What are you talking about?" She turned from the stove to face him. "No," she said. "I mean next Thanksgiving. November. I want to include them. The German women. I want them at our table." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke. Jack set down his coffee cup with more force than necessary. "Sarah," he said slowly, "our son died fighting these people. You want to break bread with them? Share our table? Our traditions?" She moved to sit across from him, her hands folded on the worn wood surface. "David died fighting the Nazis," she corrected. "These women aren't Nazis, Jack. They're just girls who got caught up in something bigger than they understood. And they're suffering now. They've lost everything. Just like we lost David. Maybe more. Jack stood abruptly, pacing to the window. He stared out at the bunkhouse where lamplight glowed in the windows. He thought about David, about the telegram, about the rage that had sustained him through months of grief. But he also thought about Liesel's face when she learned her parents were dead. About Anna's broken sobs. About Frida's hollow eyes. What would David want? Sarah asked softly. Would he want us to hate forever? Or would he want us to show these women what America really stands for? Jack was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "It's 9 months away," he said. "A lot can change in 9 months." Sarah nodded. "That's why I'm telling you now, so we can think about it, prepare ourselves. Maybe by November, we'll be ready. Maybe by November, they will too." Over the following weeks, Sarah began quietly preparing. She did not announce her plan to anyone beyond Jack, but she started setting aside supplies, making mental notes of recipes, thinking about how to make the meal meaningful. She knew it would be controversial. Some neighbors would be outraged. But something in her heart told her it was right, that breaking bread with former enemies might be the most American thing she could possibly do. November 20th, 1945. The war in the Pacific had ended in August, and victory celebrations had swept across America. But at the Morrison Ranch, the end of the war brought complicated questions about what would happen to the German women. Repatriation procedures were being discussed, but the chaos in occupied Germany meant no clear timeline existed. The women lived, in a state of suspended animation, neither prisoners nor free, neither German nor American, belonging nowhere and to nothing. Sarah Morrison had not forgotten her resolve. As November arrived, she began preparing in earnest for the Thanksgiving meal she had proposed 9 months earlier. Jack had eventually agreed, though his consent came with visible struggle. The other ranch hands had mixed reactions when they learned of the plan. Danny Brennan supported it immediately, his natural warmth extending easily to the idea of inclusion. Samuel Chen understood it on a deeper level, recognizing it as an act of radical hospitality that transcended mere kindness. Buck Henderson remained skeptical but agreed to participate, largely out of respect for Sarah rather than enthusiasm for the plan. The women learned of the invitation through Liesel, who had been called to the main house one afternoon. Sarah stood in her kitchen, surrounded by the beginnings of feast preparation, and spoke directly to the young German woman whose English had become remarkably fluent. "Liesel," Sarah said, her voice steady but emotional, "Jack and I would like to invite you and the other women to share Thanksgiving dinner with us. Here, at our table, as our guests." Liesel stared at her, unable to immediately comprehend what she was hearing. "Mrs. Morrison," she finally said, "we are prisoners. You have lost your son because of our country. Why would you show us such kindness?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained strong. "Because hatred has to end somewhere," she said. "Because my son died believing in American values, and those values include forgiveness and second chances. Because you are not the enemy anymore. You are just people who need to know they are not beyond redemption." When Liesel translated the invitation to the other women that evening, the reaction was overwhelming. Several women wept openly. Anna Schneider asked repeatedly if it was real, if they had truly been invited to American family table. Frida Klein, who had barely spoken since learning of her family's deaths, smiled for the first time in months. Even Elise Weber, hardened by grief and loss, felt something crack in the armor she had built around her heart. The days leading up to Thanksgiving became a collaborative effort that no one had anticipated. The women asked if they could help with preparations, and Sarah gratefully accepted. They worked side by side in the ranch kitchen, German and American women preparing an American feast together. Anna, drawing on her nursing training, proved skilled at precise measurements. Frida's experience in her father's bakery made her invaluable for bread and pie making. Liesel coordinated between the groups, translating recipes and techniques, building bridges with every word. The kitchen filled with the scent of cinnamon, roasting turkey, and fresh bread, smells that transcended nationality and spoke only of home and comfort and belonging. Next, follow the strict word count of 500 words only, nothing more. Thanksgiving Day, 1945. The morning arrived clear and cold, the Montana sky stretching endlessly overhead like a blue cathedral. Inside the Morrison Ranch house, tables had been pushed together and extended to accommodate everyone, American ranch hands and German prisoners together. Sarah had used her best tablecloths, salvaged from before the war when such things mattered. Mismatched plates and silverware created a patchwork of domesticity that somehow felt more honest than uniformity would have. The women arrived at noon, dressed in their cleanest clothes, nervous and uncertain. They had never been inside the main house for anything other than work. Now they were entering as guests, a transformation that felt almost dreamlike in its improbability. Jack Morrison stood at the head of the table, his weathered hands gripping the back of his chair. The turkey sat before him, golden and enormous, surrounded by bowls of mashed potatoes, gravy, stuffing, green beans, cranberry sauce, and 3 different pies cooling on the sideboard. It was abundance in a world that had known too much scarcity, generosity in a context defined by conflict. He cleared his throat, and the room fell silent. Everyone knew this moment carried weight beyond a simple meal. "Before we eat," Jack said, his voice rougher than usual, "I want to say something. A year ago, I did not think I could sit at a table with German prisoners. I lost my son to this war, and that loss nearly destroyed me." He paused, his eyes moving across the faces gathered around his table. "But Sarah reminded me of something I had forgotten. She reminded me that hatred is easy and forgiveness is hard, and that we honor our dead not by clinging to anger but by choosing to be better than our grief demands." He looked directly at Liesel, then at Anna, then at each of the German women in turn. "You did not kill my son," he said. "War killed my son. And war kills everyone it touches, one way or another. Today, we are not Americans and Germans. We are just people, sharing food and gratitude." Sarah stepped forward, her own eyes bright with tears. "Please," she said simply, "sit. Be welcome at our table." The women moved slowly to their assigned seats, still uncertain this was real. Danny Brennan began passing dishes, his easy manner helping to break the tension. Samuel Chen poured water and coffee, moving quietly around the table. Buck Henderson, who had resisted this moment most strongly, found himself seated next to Frida Klein. Then Jack Morrison began to carve the turkey. The sound of the knife moving through the meat, the sight of him placing generous portions on plates, the act of passing those plates to prisoners who had become something more than prisoners, all of it combined into a moment of profound transformation. When the first plate reached Anna Schneider, she stared at it with disbelief. The abundance, the care, the simple act of being served by the man whose son had died fighting her country, it overwhelmed her completely. Tears began streaming down her face, and she could not stop them. One by one, the other German women began crying as well, not from sadness, but from the unexpected grace of being treated as human beings worthy of dignity and kindness. December brought official word from Washington about repatriation procedures. The war was over, and prisoners were to be returned to their countries of origin. For the German women at Morrison Ranch, this news arrived with the force of a second winter storm, disrupting the fragile peace they had found in Montana. Transport would be arranged for mid-January, giving them less than 6 weeks to prepare for return to a homeland many of them no longer recognized or wanted to see. The Thanksgiving meal had changed everything. The walls between captor and captive had dissolved into something resembling community, and now that community was being torn apart by bureaucratic necessity. Liesel sat in the bunkhouse one evening, helping the younger women sort through their few possessions. Anna Schneider had been crying intermittently for days, terrified of returning to Munich, where her entire family was dead and nothing remained of her former life. Frida Klein had become almost catatonic, unable to process the thought of going back to Stuttgart's ruins. Even Elise Weber, usually so stoic, seemed deeply troubled by the approaching departure. "Mrs. Morrison asked me to stay," Liesel said quietly, breaking the heavy silence. The other women looked up sharply. "She and Jack have offered to sponsor me, to help me apply for permission to remain in America as a displaced person. The legal status exists now for people like us who have nowhere to return to." The words hung in the cold air. Anna spoke first, her voice barely a whisper. Can they do that? Can any of us stay? Liesel nodded slowly. It is complicated, and there are no guarantees, but Sarah has been corresponding with immigration officials. She believes it is possible for those of us who have no family left, who have no homes to return to. The question is, she paused, searching for the right words, do we want to stay in the country we once considered our enemy? Or do we return to help rebuild the country that committed such terrible crimes? Over the following days, intense discussions filled the bunkhouse during evening hours. Some women felt a duty to return, to participate in Germany's reconstruction regardless of how painful it might be. Others could not bear the thought of going back to cities reduced to rubble, to communities that would view them as failures, to a national identity now synonymous with unprecedented evil. Sarah and Jack Morrison met privately with each woman who expressed interest in staying. They explained the process, the challenges, the uncertainty involved. They made no promises beyond their willingness to help, to sponsor, to advocate. Danny Brennan and Samuel Chen also stepped forward, offering to help find work and housing for any women who chose to remain. Even Buck Henderson, transformed by months of proximity and the Thanksgiving meal, grudgingly admitted he would support the effort. By early January, 9 women had decided to attempt to stay in America. 14 chose repatriation, wanting to return despite everything to help rebuild their broken homeland. The decision split the group but not their bonds. They had become sisters through shared trauma and unexpected grace, and that connection would transcend whatever paths they chose. 20 years later, autumn 1965, Liesel Mueller Morrison stood in the kitchen of her own ranch house, not far from where Jack and Sarah had first welcomed her to their table 2 decades earlier. She was an American citizen now, married to Danny Brennan, and mother to 3 children who knew their mother's history but could barely imagine the world she had come from. The scars of war had faded but never disappeared, carried quietly in the careful way she never wasted food, in how she taught her children about forgiveness, in the letters she still exchanged with the women who had returned to Germany. Anna Schneider had become a nurse in Munich, dedicating her life to healing in a country that desperately needed it. She had married a doctor who had lost his entire family in the camps, and together they had built something new from shared grief. Frida Klein had reopened her family's bakery in Stuttgart, using recipes her father had taught her, creating sweetness in a city still rebuilding from rubble. Elise Weber had never remarried but had become a teacher, shaping young minds to understand the dangers of blind nationalism and the necessity of moral courage. Each woman who had returned carried with them the memory of that Thanksgiving table, proof that former enemies could become family. The 9 who had stayed in America had scattered across the country but remained connected. They gathered occasionally, these German women who had chosen a new homeland, sharing stories and memories, reminding each other of the journey that had brought them here. They had become teachers, nurses, businesswomen, mothers. They had contributed to their adopted country in ways both large and small, living testimonies to the power of second chances. Sarah Morrison had passed away 5 years earlier, but not before seeing the fruits of her radical act of hospitality. She had watched Liesel marry Danny, had held their first child, had witnessed the transformation of prisoners into citizens, enemies into family. Jack Morrison, now 70, still ran the ranch with help from his sons-in-law and grandchildren. He kept a photograph on his mantle, a picture taken that Thanksgiving Day in 1945. In it, Americans and Germans sat together around a laden table, their faces showing the tentative hope of people discovering they could choose forgiveness over hatred. He looked at that photograph often, thinking about David, about the cost of war, about the courage required to lay down anger and pick up grace instead. The story of that Thanksgiving had become something of a legend in Montana, told and retold as an example of what America could be at its best. Liesel often spoke to church groups and schools about her experience, about arriving as an enemy and being transformed by unexpected kindness. She spoke about the power of a shared meal, about how breaking bread together could break down walls that seemed insurmountable. Cowboys said, "Taste the turkey and pie," she would tell audiences, and we tasted more than food. We tasted the possibility of redemption, of belonging, of home. That day, we learned that identity is not only what you are born into, but what you choose to become. And we chose to become something new.